The world ended quietly. Not with the roar of nuclear fire or the flash of some great cosmic event, but with a whisper, a bite, and then silence. The cities that once pulsed with millions of voices fell still, one block at a time, one scream at a time, until all that remained was the low, endless moan of the dead. Every name on every map became nothing more than a graveyard wearing the skin of civilization. The roads stretching between those dead cities told their own story. Rusted cars sat bumper to bumper in frozen caravans that never reached safety. Suitcases lay split open on the asphalt, their contents bleached by sun and rain. Every mile marker was a monument to someone who did not make it. And between those cars, between those scattered remnants of a life no one would live again, the walkers moved. Patient, their jaws clicking open and shut with the dull rhythm of a clock that would never stop ticking. They did not think. They did not plan. They simply hungered, and that hunger had consumed everything. This was the world now. Not a battlefield, not a war zone. Just a long, decaying silence stretching from coast to coast, broken only by the shuffling of dead feet and the occasional desperate gunshot of some survivor clinging to one more day. Humanity had not lost a war. Humanity had simply been replaced by something that did not need to sleep, did not need to eat anything other than flesh, and never, ever stopped walking. And then, on a cracked stretch of highway outside a nameless town in Georgia, reality itself seemed to bruise. The air above the road shimmered and twisted, pulling light into a shape that should not have existed. The color was wrong. Not the glow of a fire or the flash of lightning, but something deeper, something biological, as if the atmosphere itself had been infected. A sound rippled outward, low and wet, like tissue tearing at a cellular level. The asphalt beneath the distortion blackened and cracked. Nearby walkers stopped their aimless wandering and turned toward the anomaly, drawn by some primitive signal even their rotting brains could register. The tear widened, and from within it a body fell. He hit the pavement hard enough to crater it. For a long moment he did not move, and the walkers began to close in, dozens of them converging from every direction with that terrible, patient shuffle. Their fingers, stripped of skin in places, reached toward the figure on the ground. Then James Heler opened his eyes. The first thing he registered was the smell. Decay. Old decay. Not the sharp chemical rot of a Blacklight outbreak zone, but something organic and ancient, like a wound left open for months under the sun. The second thing he registered was the circle of corpses stumbling toward him. Their eyes were clouded. Their skin hung loose on their bones. Several were missing limbs entirely, yet still they reached for him. Heler rose to his feet in a single fluid motion, and the nearest walker lunged. Its teeth scraped across his forearm and shattered like dry porcelain against stone. Heler looked down at the creature clinging to him with its broken mouth and felt something between confusion and pity. He had fought Blacklight hunters that could tear through armored vehicles. He had traded blows with creatures designed to end civilizations. This thing weighed barely 100 pounds and moved like it was underwater. He shoved it away and it crumpled, its ribcage folding inward like wet cardboard. More pressed in. He swatted them aside without thinking, each swing sending bodies tumbling across the highway like discarded toys. Within seconds, the immediate circle of walkers was down, twitching and broken on the ground. But beyond them, more were coming. 100, 200, pouring from the tree line and from between the rusted vehicles, an endless, moaning river of dead flesh converging on the only living pulse for miles. Heler watched them come and realized something unsettling. These were not infected in any way he understood. There was no viral intelligence behind those clouded eyes. No mutation driving them toward greater lethality. They were simply dead things that refused to stop moving. And this world, whatever it was, had no soldiers, no quarantine zones, no military response, just the dead, and whatever remained of the living hiding somewhere in the silence. In the first hours after his arrival, Heler moved through the Georgia countryside like a natural disaster wearing human skin. A horde of several hundred walkers had gathered along a stretch of interstate near an overturned tanker truck, their bodies pressed together in a groaning mass that blocked the road from shoulder to shoulder. Heler walked straight into them. His arms shifted, the biomass beneath his skin restructuring in an instant, and massive black claws extended from his hands, each one longer than a man's forearm and harder than tempered steel. He swept them in wide arcs, and the front rows of walkers simply came apart. Torsos separated from legs. Heads tumbled free from necks. The sound was wet and heavy, like a blade dragged through overripe fruit, and it did not stop. He pushed forward through the horde without slowing. Tendrils erupted from his back and lashed outward in every direction, each one punching through multiple walkers at once before retracting and striking again. The dead fell in waves. Entire clusters were lifted off the ground and hurled aside, their bodies breaking against the rusted cars lining the road. Within minutes, the horde that had blocked the highway was nothing but a carpet of motionless remains stretching a quarter-mile in every direction. Heler stood in the center of it, his claws slowly retracting, and felt nothing. No exhaustion. No injury. Not even the faint sting of exertion. It was like crushing insects. He moved on, following the highway south, and every pocket of walkers he encountered met the same fate. A cluster of 30 pressed against the windows of an abandoned gas station dissolved in seconds. A wandering column of perhaps 200 that had been trailing some long-gone scent scattered like broken dolls when his tendrils swept through them. He did not need to plan. He did not need to strategize. There was no adaptation from these creatures, no learning, no escalation. They simply walked toward him and he ended them. And people noticed. A woman crouched on the roof of a strip mall watched through binoculars as Heler dismantled a walker horde below her. She did not lower the binoculars for a full 3 minutes. When she finally did, her hands were shaking. She climbed down to the small group of survivors huddled inside and told them what she had seen. They did not believe her. They sent a man to look for himself, and he came back pale, unable to speak for almost an hour. Word began to travel the way all information traveled in the dead world. In fragments and whispers passed between survivors at trading posts and along fence lines. Someone had seen a figure tear through 100 walkers without a weapon. Someone else had found the aftermath, a road covered in destroyed remains with no shell casings, no tire tracks, no explanation. A family fleeing north described a shape moving through the trees at impossible speed, something tall and dark that left only silence behind it. The stories did not agree on what it was. Some said a new kind of infected, something the virus had finally perfected after years of rotting failures. Others said it was military, a government experiment that had been released as a last resort. A few, the desperate ones, the ones who still prayed to a god they were not sure existed anymore, whispered that it might be something sent to help. But Heler himself felt no sense of mission. He wandered through the dead towns and the empty fields, and with each horde he destroyed he found the victory more hollow than the last. In his own world, every fight had meant something. Every creature he killed was one step closer to stopping Alex Mercer, one step closer to protecting the people who remained. There had been a structure to his violence, a purpose threaded through every act of destruction. Here the dead simply respawned from the silence. He could clear a town today, and it would be full again by the week's end. The walkers drifting in from somewhere beyond the horizon like a tide that never finished rising. And so the question that would come to define his existence in this broken world began to take shape in the back of his mind, quiet at first, but growing louder with every effortless kill. What was the point? He found them by accident. A cluster of buildings surrounded by a makeshift wall of corrugated metal and sharpened logs, tucked into a clearing about a mile off the main road. The wall was crude but functional, lined with watchtowers built from scrap wood and topped with barbed wire scavenged from old fences. Inside, roughly 60 people lived in the careful, rationed rhythm of those who had learned to measure every resource down to the last drop of water and the last bullet in the chamber. Heler approached from the south, where a walker group of about 40 had been pressing against the wall for days. The sentries on the towers had been taking careful shots, 1 round per kill, conserving ammunition the way a man dying of thirst conserves the last sip in his canteen. They were losing ground slowly. The walkers had begun to pile against the base of the wall, and the weight of their collective push was bending the metal inward. Then Heler stepped out of the tree line. The sentries saw him move into the horde and they stopped shooting. Every person on that wall went silent. Heller's claws extended and he carved through the walkers with the mechanical precision of a man clearing brush. Bodies fell left and right. The entire group was down in under a minute. Heler retracted his claws, looked up at the sentry staring down at him, and said nothing. They opened the gate. For the first 2 days, the settlement treated Heler like a miracle. Children pointed at him from behind their parents. The council, a group of 5 survivors who made decisions for the community, offered him food and shelter, both of which he declined without explanation. He did not eat what they ate. He did not sleep the way they slept. He simply existed among them, a silent figure who sat on the wall at night and watched the darkness beyond the tree line with eyes that never seemed to tire. On the 3rd day, a woman named Grace asked him directly what he was. Heler told her the truth, or at least as much of it as he understood. He told her about the Blacklight virus, about what it had done to his body, about the powers it had given him, and the things he had been forced to do with those powers. Grace listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she nodded once and walked away. By the evening, half the settlement knew what he had said. By the next morning, the atmosphere had changed entirely. People stopped making eye contact with him. Parents pulled their children indoors when he walked past. The council held a closed meeting that lasted 3 hours, and when they emerged, they asked Heler, politely but firmly, to stay outside the walls at night. For the safety of the community, they said. Just as a precaution. Heler understood. He had seen this before. In New York, after the first outbreak, survivors had feared the infected more than the military that was supposed to protect them. Fear did not require logic. It only required a reason, and Heler had given them plenty. He moved to a position just outside the southern wall, close enough to intervene if walkers approached, but far enough to give the survivors the distance they needed. At night, he could hear their conversations drifting over the metal barrier. They talked about him the way ancient people might have talked about a wolf living at the edge of their village, grateful that it kept other predators away, terrified that one day it might turn its hunger inward. A young man named Dion was the only one who regularly came outside to talk to him. Dion had lost his entire family in the first months and had survived alone for nearly a year before finding the settlement. He was not afraid of Heler because, as he explained one evening, he had already lost everything worth being afraid for. It was Dion who told Heler about the raiders, about the faction that had been terrorizing settlements across the region, about the people who had decided that the end of the world was not a tragedy, but an opportunity. And it was Dion who first saw the look that crossed Heller's face when he heard what those raiders had done to the people they captured. It was not pity. It was recognition. The raiders called themselves the Reapers, though survivors who had encountered them and lived to speak of it used darker names. They operated out of a fortified compound built around an old distribution warehouse about 20 miles northeast of the settlement, a sprawling structure surrounded by concrete barriers, mounted floodlights powered by generators, and vehicles welded with armor plating and sharpened metal spikes. Their numbers sat somewhere around 150, and they were organized with a discipline that most survivor groups could not match. They had hierarchy. They had supply line. They had rules, though those rules served only the strong. Their leader was a man known only as Carver. Before the outbreak, he had been nobody in particular, but the apocalypse had revealed something in him that polite society had kept buried. He understood violence the way a musician understands rhythm, instinctively, completely, and without remorse. Under his command, the Reapers had systematically dismantled every independent settlement within a 50-mile radius. They took food, weapons, medicine, and people. Those who cooperated were allowed to live as laborers within the compound. Those who resisted were made into examples, and the things done to those examples were designed to ensure that the next settlement would not resist at all. Dion told Heler everything he knew while they sat outside the wall beneath a sky choked with stars that no longer had cities to compete with. He spoke about convoys that arrived at settlements under the pretense of trade before drawing weapons. He spoke about families separated, men forced into work gangs, women taken into the compound and never seen again. He spoke about a father from a neighboring settlement who had tried to fight back and whose body had been hung from a highway overpass as a warning, left there for the walkers to slowly pick apart over the course of weeks. Heler listened in silence. His expression did not change during the telling, but something shifted beneath the surface, something old and familiar. He had spent years in the military before the Blacklight virus had rewritten his biology. He had seen what men with power did to those without it when no one was watching. In the ruins of New York, he had watched Black Watch soldiers execute civilians under the banner of containment. He had watched Alex Mercer manipulate an entire city like a chessboard, sacrificing thousands to feed his own evolution. The faces changed. The uniforms changed. But the fundamental architecture of cruelty never did. He told Dion he would not get involved. The settlement was safe enough behind its walls. The Reapers had not targeted it yet. There was no reason to provoke a conflict that could bring 100 armed fighters down on 60 people hiding behind scrap metal. Dion accepted this without argument, and for a while, the uneasy peace held. Then the convoy arrived. It came at dawn, 3 armored trucks rolling down the access road with Reaper markings painted on their doors. They stopped just outside the gate, and a man climbed out of the lead vehicle holding a megaphone. He delivered their terms calmly. Half of the settlement's food supply, all firearms, and 10 able-bodied workers to be surrendered by sundown. Failure to comply would result in consequences. He said the word consequences the way someone might describe the weather, flat and factual, as though what would follow was simply nature taking its course. The council tried to negotiate. They offered a smaller share of food. They begged for more time. The man with the megaphone smiled and shook his head. Behind him, 2 Reapers dragged a bound figure from the back of a truck and forced him to his knees. He was a scout from the settlement who had been sent out 3 days prior and had not returned. The man with the megaphone looked at the council members standing on the wall and told them this was what happened to people who wasted his time. Then a Reaper put a blade through the scout's throat while 60 people watched from behind their fragile barricade. The convoy left. The body stayed where it fell. Heler, standing at the edge of the tree line 100 yards from the gate, had seen everything. He had heard the scout choking. He had heard the silence that followed, the terrible collective silence of people who have just been shown exactly how powerless they truly are. Heler looked at the body on the ground and felt something crack open inside himself. Not grief. Grief was too soft a word for what moved through him. It was the same black ignition that had driven him through the streets of New York when his family was taken from him. The same cold, focused fury that had carried him up through the ranks of Blacklight nightmares until he stood face to face with the architect of every horror the virus had spawned. He had told himself this was not his war. He had been wrong. Heler moved through the night like something the darkness itself had decided to send. He covered the 20 miles between the settlement and the Reaper compound in under an hour. Running at a speed no vehicle in this dead world could match, his feet barely touching the cracked highway before launching forward again in long, silent strides that ate the distance like it was nothing. The trees on either side of the road blurred into a single dark wall. The walkers he passed did not even have time to turn their heads before he was gone. The compound came into view just after midnight. Floodlights carved white circles into the surrounding darkness, and the hum of generators carried across the open ground like a mechanical heartbeat. Sentries stood at regular intervals along the concrete barriers, rifles slung over their shoulders, cigarettes glowing like tiny orange stars. Inside the perimeter, Heler could see the warehouse, the vehicle yard, rows of makeshift barracks, and a smaller building near the center that radiated authority in its construction. That would be where Carver operated. That would be the heart. Heler did not announce himself. He did not offer terms or warnings. He simply moved. The first sentry died without making a sound. Heller's hand closed around the man's throat and squeezed once, then lowered the body to the ground as gently as setting down a sleeping child. The second sentry turned at the faint noise and saw something standing in the floodlight's edge that his brain could not process. A figure whose arms had become something other than arms. Something long and bladed and gleaming with a darkness that seemed to drink the light around it. He opened his mouth to shout. A tendril punched through his chest before the first syllable left his lips. Then the silence ended. An alarm shrieked across the compound, and the Reapers responded with the speed of people who had survived the apocalypse by being faster and more violent than everyone else. Armed fighters poured from the barracks. Vehicle-mounted spotlights swung toward the perimeter breach. Gunfire erupted in sharp, staccato bursts as rounds tore through the air toward the shape moving through their defenses. The bullets hit Heler. Every single one of them hit him, and every single one of them did absolutely nothing. His body absorbed the impacts the way water absorbs stones, small ripples of displaced biomass that sealed over in fractions of a second. He did not flinch. He did not slow. He walked through the gunfire like a man walking through rain, and when he reached the first cluster of shooters, his claws swept through them in a single horizontal arc that left nothing standing. Panic spread faster than any infection ever could. The Reapers had built their power on the understanding that they were the most dangerous thing left alive. They had crushed settlements and broken survivors and ruled their territory through the absolute certainty that no one could match their capacity for violence. That certainty shattered in the space of seconds as they watched their bullets fail and the fighters fall, and something that was not a man carved through their ranks like a scythe through dry wheat. Heler reached the vehicle yard, and tendrils erupted from his body in massive sweeping arcs. They wrapped around an armored truck and flipped it end over end into a row of barracks. The structure collapsed in a cloud of dust and screaming metal. A second truck met the same fate, launched sideways into the concrete barrier with enough force to crack it from top to bottom. Fighters who tried to flee on foot found tendrils waiting, lashing out from impossible distances to pull them back into the maelstrom. The warehouse doors burst open and a column of Reapers emerged carrying heavier weapons. A mounted gun roared to life, the rounds chewing into Heler's torso in a continuous stream. He absorbed them all. Then he surged forward and drove his claws through the weapons housing, splitting it in half along with the man behind it. The column broke and scattered, but there was nowhere to go. Heler was everywhere and nowhere, moving at speeds that turned him into a blur of black biomass and red destruction. The entire assault lasted less than 15 minutes. When it was over, the compound was unrecognizable. Buildings leaned at broken angles. Vehicles lay overturned and burning. The floodlights had been torn from their mounts, and the only illumination came from the scattered fires that dotted the wreckage like dying stars. The generators had gone silent. The alarm had gone silent. Everything had gone silent. Carver was the last. Heler found him in the central building, standing behind a desk with a pistol in his hand. He fired 6 rounds into Heler's chest. Heler did not slow. He crossed the room and lifted Carver off the ground by his collar and held him there, feet dangling, while the man who had terrorized an entire region gasped and clawed uselessly at the fingers around his neck. Heler looked into his eyes and saw nothing worth saving. No remorse. No fear of judgment. Just the animal panic of a predator who had finally met something higher on the chain. And somewhere beyond the compound walls, hidden among the trees in the distant darkness, a handful of survivors who had followed the sounds of destruction watched the fires, burning, and wondered whether what they had just witnessed was salvation or something far worse. The settlement reclaimed itself slowly in the days that followed. Scouts confirmed that the Reaper compound had been destroyed completely. Supply caches were recovered from the wreckage, enough food and medicine and ammunition to sustain the community for months. The 10-mile radius around the settlement, once a gauntlet of raider patrols and walker herds, fell quiet in a way that felt almost holy. People walked outside the walls for the first time in weeks. Children played in an open field while their parents stood watch, not because they had to, but because the habit of fear does not die easily. Heler watched it all from a distance. He sat on the roof of an abandoned fire station about half a mile from the settlement, his legs hanging over the edge, and looked out across a landscape that stretched flat and green and empty toward a horizon he could not name. The walkers were still out there. He could sense them in the way a sailor can sense a distant storm, a faint pressure on the edge of perception. Thousands and thousands of dead things shuffling endlessly through the ruins of a world they had consumed. He had destroyed the Reapers. Every last one. He had collapsed their compound, shattered their vehicles, and ended the reign of a man who had turned the apocalypse into his personal kingdom. And the people he had saved were genuinely safer for it. But the world was not fixed. That was the truth Heler could not escape, the one that sat in his chest like a stone he could not dissolve no matter how much biomass he threw at it. In his old world, there had been a structure to the crisis. There were labs developing cures. There were military leaders making decisions, terrible decisions sometimes, but decisions aimed at an endgame. There was a system, broken and corrupt and often monstrous, but a system nonetheless. The Blacklight virus was an enemy that could theoretically be defeated. Alex Mercer was a target that could theoretically be destroyed. Every fight Heler had ever fought existed within a framework that pointed towards something better on the other side. This world had no other side. The walkers were not a virus that could be cured. They were not an army that could be defeated. They were a permanent condition, a fundamental rewriting of the rules of life on Earth. Every human who died would rise again and join the horde. Every settlement that fell would feed the tide. The mathematics of it were simple and absolute. Humanity was losing, not because it lacked courage or will or cleverness, but because the equation itself was designed to end only one way. And Heler, for all his impossible power, could not change that equation. He could kill 1,000,000 walkers and 1,000,000 more would come. He could destroy every raider faction on the continent, and new ones would rise from desperation of survivors who had lost everything except the willingness to take from others. He could protect this one settlement for years, for decades, but he could not rebuild a hospital, restart a government, reignite the infrastructure that had made civilization possible. His power was absolute in the context of destruction and utterly meaningless in the context of creation. This was not something he had ever been forced to confront. In New York, the fight had been personal. Find Mercer. Kill Mercer. Protect what remains. The goals were clear and his abilities were perfectly suited to achieve them. Here, the goals dissolved the moment he tried to define them. Protect the survivors. From what? From everything? Forever? He thought about his daughter, Amaya. The memory of her was the one piece of his old life that the Blacklight virus had never been able to consume. She had been the reason he fought, the reason he endured horrors that would have broken any ordinary man. If she were here, in this world, he would burn every walker on the planet to ash without hesitation. He would tear the earth apart and rebuild it with his bare hands if that was what it took. But she was not here. And without her, without that anchor, the power that defined him felt less like a gift and more like a sentence. A man built for war standing in a world where war itself had become meaningless. The sun set over the empty horizon and Heler remained where he was, still and silent, the most powerful being in a world that power alone could not save. He left on a morning when the fog hung low across the fields and the settlement was still sleeping behind its walls. He did not say goodbye to the council. He did not leave a message. He simply walked through the gate, past the sentries who watched him go in silence, and disappeared into the gray light that swallowed the road ahead. Dion was the only one who saw him leave. He stood at the southern watchtower and watched Heller's silhouette grow smaller against the pale horizon until it merged with the mist and was gone. He did not call out. He understood in the quiet way that people who have survived great loss understand each other, that Heler was not leaving because he no longer cared. He was leaving because staying in one place would mean accepting that this broken world was his home. And Heler was not ready for that. Perhaps he never would be. The settlement endured. The supplies recovered from the Reaper compound carried them through the following months. New survivors arrived, drawn by the rumor of a safe place in a region that had been cleared of both raiders and the worst of the walker herds. The walls grew taller. The watchtowers grew stronger. And in the evenings, when the community gathered to share what little comfort they could find in each other's company, the stories began. They said there was something out there in the wasteland, something that was not alive and not dead. Something that moved through the walker herds like a storm through a field of dry grass, leaving nothing but stillness in its wake. Travelers arriving from the north spoke of a town that had been overrun by a horde of thousands and then, overnight, emptied completely, every walker destroyed, the streets littered with remains that looked as though they had been torn apart by a force no human weapon could produce. A trader from the coast described a figure standing on a highway overpass at dusk, perfectly still, watching the dead shuffle below with an expression that was not anger and not sadness but something older than both. She said the figure turned and looked at her across a distance of 200 yards, and she felt, in that single moment, the full weight of something she could not describe. A gravity, as though the air around him carried the memory of every impossible thing he had ever done. The story spread the way all legends spread in a world without books or screens, through the voices of the living, told and retold around fires that burned in the darkness of a civilization that refused to completely die. Each telling added something new. Each retelling shaped the myth a little further from the man and a little closer to the monument. Some called him a monster, a leftover nightmare from whatever catastrophe had birthed the walkers themselves. Others called him a guardian, the last true weapon humanity had ever produced, still fighting long after the war had been lost. And somewhere out beyond the firelight, beyond the walls and the watchtowers, and the fragile circles of warmth that the living clung to against the endless cold of the dead world, James Heler kept walking. He did not know where he was going. He only knew he was not done.